Hi, my name is Livia, and today's video is my review of Stillhouse Lake by Rachel Caine. I just want to give a quick disclaimer before I get started that this book is fairly graphic with some very vivid imagery and lots of violence, so if that's something that you're not comfortable reading about, I definitely would not recommend this one. As always, this review is spoiler-free, with the exception of a few details that are revealed in the summary and within the first 10 or so pages of the book. With that being said, let's get into the review. The book opens with Gina Royal and her children returning home from running errands to find that the property is overrun with police officers after a drunken driver has crashed into the side of her garage. The contents of the garage catch Gina by surprise. The area that had been completely off limits to her for most of her marriage was actually the location of her serial killer husband's lair, where he liked to torture and kill his victims. The story then picks up 5 years later, during which time Gina has changed her name and identity, as well as those of her children, and she's moved around from town to town, never settling in one area for an extended period of time. The constant moves and assumptions of new identities are all efforts to evade the public ridicule that follows Gina and her children following her husband's conviction. Despite being acquitted, Gina has been cast as guilty in the eyes of the public, and she's relentlessly hounded by people both in person and over the internet. Gina ultimately relocates to a house near Stillhouse Lake, where she's hoping she and her children can settle down and establish some friendships and roots in the area. The plot then follows the series of unfortunate and haunting events that hound Gina and her children in this seemingly idyllic town. One of my favorite aspects of this book was the unique lens through which it portrays the events that are unfolding. Instead of being told from the perspective of the serial killer, who serves as the basis for much of the plot, it conveys the psychological impacts that his actions have on those around him, particularly those within his immediate family. As a result, it was very interesting to watch Gina's character development and character arc as she devolved from a blindsided wife into someone with a jaded, more cynical outlook on the world. With her new identity came an entirely new demeanor and persona, and she was truly a force to be reckoned with, willing to do anything to protect her children. One of my most hated tropes in psychological thrillers is the helpless, damsel in distress portrayal of the female protagonist, and Gina helps to break this mold immediately from the outset of the book. With that being said, I did spend much of the book trying to figure out how reliable Gina was as a narrator. Everything was recounted from her perspective, which led me to question how forthcoming she was of information and how honest she was being about her involvement or lack thereof in her husband's murders. Needless to say, I enjoyed this suspenseful aspect of the book, and it kept me on my toes, searching for any contradictions or slip-ups in her narrative that would have served as clues as to her reliability. Another terrifying aspect of this book is its commentary on human nature and how adeptly people are able to hide their character flaws, even from those who know them the best. It also shows how a gruesome revelation, like finding out that there's a serial killer in the family, affects everyone around them, their parents, their friends, their spouses, their children. And it was really interesting to watch how differently both Gina and her children reacted to the situation. I really enjoyed seeing their definitions of right and wrong, as well as morally gray areas in certain situations, and how this differed from their mother's perspective. This is one of the few adult books, and thrillers in general, that I've read, in which the children were not incredibly obnoxious, and I actually valued what they had to add to the story. It was immediately clear that they served more of a purpose than a few simple plot points to extend the story, and it was really interesting to see their character development both in this book as a standalone and in the trilogy overall. On that note, I wish we'd had the chance to see a little bit more of them in this book and how they were adjusting to the new surroundings, making friends, and settling in at Stillhouse Lake. I also enjoyed the raw accuracy and unfiltered approach to the public's perception of this family. Everyone was very quick to condemn Gina and try to include her as having some role in her husband's murders, and I think this was a really accurate representation of how something like this would unfold today. Consequently, this book really reveals the dangers of the general public deciding whether someone is innocent or guilty, regardless of the factual evidence or lack thereof to substantiate those claims. It also takes things a step further, warning about the dangers of the anonymity on the internet and how this tends to strip away people's filters. They're more willing to freely speak their minds without worrying about severe repercussions, and we got to see how this impacts the individuals involved. With respect to the pacing, the first 100 pages or so were a whirlwind of activity and immediately drew me into the story. However, after the initial action and the inciting incident had died down a bit, there was a significant chunk of this book that was fairly slow and character-driven. The author used this as an opportunity to show a lot of the character backstories, as well as show their progression moving forward from the initial incident at the start of the book. It was by no means a fast-paced book entirely throughout, so I wouldn't recommend it for purely plot-driven readers. This middle section of the novel was definitely more character-driven, and I would have liked to see a little bit more plot to keep me more interested in the story. The plot did pick back up, though, for the last 150 pages or so of the book, and I found myself enjoying this section a lot more when there was a lot more going on and you weren't quite sure what was happening at any given time. Tension was gradually building up until the conclusion of the book, and it ended with quite a big twist that I did not see coming. I really enjoy thrillers that can completely blindside me like this. I thought I had figured it all out and fit all the pieces together, and there was one final turn of events that proved everything that I had predicted wrong. For me, the ending helped to redeem the book and make up for the slower pacing in the middle of it. The book did leave off with quite a big cliffhanger, leading into the second book in the trilogy, which is Kilman Creek. While I find cliffhangers to be quite hit or miss in these first or second books in series, I enjoyed how this one was executed. It provided me with enough answers to be satisfied and to feel like something was accomplished throughout this first book, but it also left me wanting a few additional answers that I found in later books in the series. Needless to say, after finishing this one, I immediately went and picked up the second book in the series so that I could continue reading and figure out where the plot went from there. One of my main complaints for this book was some of the questionable decision-making, both for the protagonist and for some of the minor characters. There were a few occasions in the book where characters made these really poor decisions and no one stepped in to stop them, despite having complete awareness of what was going to take place before it actually happened. For example, following an injury, one of the characters decides that it would be a great idea to trek up mountainous terrain in a torrential downpour in the middle of the night, and none of the other townspeople step in, say anything, and prevent them from doing so. All things considered, though, this was a fairly minor flaw, and it wasn't even something that I picked up on until after I had finished reading and spent some time thinking about the book. All in all, I gave this book a 5 out of 5 stars. Before picking up this book, I remember being very skeptical of the trilogy setup and how something like that would work within the psychological thriller genre. At this point, I've read the first 2 books in the series, though, and it has completely changed my mind on this. Rachel Caine does an excellent job of establishing a plot structure and characters that you want to continue to see developing as the series unfolds. As a result, I think this really works as a series, and I would have been disappointed if we had just been left with Stillhouse Lake as a standalone book. I hope you enjoyed this review. Feel free to leave a comment down below with your thoughts on this book or any other Rachel Caine books that you've read or would recommend. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in my next video.